In this lesson, we are going to continue to learn about the issues that led to secession of the southern states from the Union and then ultimately the Civil War. So in the previous lesson, we learned about the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Compromise of 1850 came about because California wanted to be a state. The Mexican cession after the Mexican War to cede something, the word cession comes from cede, which is to concede or give up. And Mexico, after they lost the Mexican-American War, conceded a large portion of land in what is now the United States to the government of the United States. The first state that wanted to apply for statehood was California, and Californians wanted to be what's called free soil, or not allow slavery. The reason they did not want to allow slavery was because gold had been discovered in California in 1849. This is also why the San Francisco football team is called the San Francisco 49ers. There's the California Golden Nuggets, and many things in California are named after gold because this is what caused a mass migration of people to California in the mid-1800s to mine that gold. Now, the reason that California wanted to be a free state was because they did not want slave owners to use their slaves to mine gold. Well, if California is going to be a free state, this is going to upset the balance in the Senate that we have been hearing so much about. The Senate is balanced. California coming in as a free state is going to upset that balance. So a major compromise is going to have to be reached in order for California to join the Union. That compromise would be the Compromise of 1850. Now, the Compromise of 1850 had many parts that were good for the North and good for the South, because that's the way a compromise works. The Compromise of 1850 had several parts, 5 parts actually, and the part that the South liked the best, as has been said many times before, is the Fugitive Slave Law, which made harsher penalties for helping slaves escape in the North. And because, as been discussed before, slaves were property, if you had a runaway slave in your possession, even in the northern free states, you theoretically had stolen property in your possession. Now, another part that the South liked from the Compromise of 1850 was, unlike the Missouri Compromise, which had a line limiting slavery above the 36-degree 30-minute line, there was no northern limit to slavery. The rest of the Mexican cession could vote using the concept of popular sovereignty, whether they would be slave or free. Now, the part that the North liked about the Compromise of 1850, obviously California coming as a free state, this moved the Senate as well as the House into the control of the North, the free states, and the slave trade was outlawed in Washington, D.C. Somewhere in between this, the federal government, there was a 5th thing where they paid Texas's debt. Now, the Fugitive Slave Law would cause much controversy in the North because even free African Americans were being labeled as slaves and captured and taken to the South. And what this does is this causes increased actions to protect escaped slaves. The North passes laws, and this also motivates Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin in protest against the Fugitive Slave Act, which showed slave owners as barbaric and evil. Southerners claimed that the book was full of misconceptions about slavery, that not all slave owners are barbaric and evil. And as we've discussed before, we know Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and George Washington owned slaves, that not all were barbaric and evil. Slavery was a part of their society. Slavery itself was barbaric and evil. However, the action of all slave owners were not. Here's a few other pictures of Uncle Tom's Cabin, which this probably illustrates much of the content of it. And you can see how Northerners would turn against or would see slavery as barbaric and evil from seeing the book. But once again, the Southerners claimed it was full of lies. The lesson today is about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed in 1854, and some of you probably know when the Civil War was. The Civil War, the first shots of the Civil War were in 1861. So you can see we're 5 years from the Civil War here, and we can see how sectionalism is increasing from these actions. Now, the Kansas-Nebraska Act came about because Kansas is going to be a state. But Kansas is above the Missouri Compromise line. And of course, if it's above the Missouri Compromise line, it's supposed to be free. However, there were other issues at work here, and some politicians would have aspirations that would cause the Missouri Compromise to be done away with. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act was the result of westward expansion and north-south economic competition. The Kansas Territory, as we can see in this picture, was in the northern part of the Louisiana Territory. So according to the Missouri Compromise, it could not be a slave state. However, some politicians wanted to build a railroad across the country through Kansas, and they needed to get Southern support. So what they realized, in order to get Southern support for this railroad, they are going to have to get rid of something the South really dislikes, and that is the Missouri Compromise. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act is because of the Transcontinental Railroad. And the Transcontinental Railroad, there were two proposed routes. One, there were railroads to Chicago from the north, so that was not an issue. But the Transcontinental Railroad was going to stretch from Chicago to the west coast, all the way across the continent, and they wanted to go through Kansas. Well, which is actually right here. There was another route to the south through New Orleans. It's going to go something like this. These two proposed routes were an issue, and some politicians wanted it to go on the northern route and figured if they could get the Missouri Compromise repealed, then there would be Southern support for the northern route of the railroad. Now, one of these politicians, which you don't need to know, but I've done increased research, was Stephen Douglas, and he wanted to be president, and he needed votes from the South. So he was one of the ones leading this move to replace the Missouri Compromise and get rid of the line and the other restrictions on slavery. And he says, how can I get these votes? He says, I know. I'll try to get the Missouri Compromise line repealed. So Stephen Douglas goes to work in Washington like a lot of politicians do, spreading this, saying the Missouri Compromise line needs repealed. And if you repeal that line, then the Southern representatives will support the Northern Transcontinental Railroad route. And eventually, it happens. Stephen Douglas doesn't become president. He does run against Lincoln, but the Missouri Compromise line gets repealed and replaced with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So, Stephen Douglas pretty much says, hey, Congress, let's pass the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which will repeal the Missouri Compromise. And, like the Compromise of 1850, let's let the rest of the Louisiana Purchase choose by popular sovereignty if they're going to allow slaves or be free soil. Now, he must have had supporters in Congress because both houses of Congress, the House, the Senate, and the President signs the Missouri Compromise, or the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and it becomes law. Now, we're going to look at the effect of this and what happens because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So, Stephen Douglas said, support the Northern Railroad route, and when it comes time, vote me for president. So, the Kansas-Nebraska Act would replace the Missouri Compromise. The Missouri Compromise would be replaced by the Kansas-Nebraska Act. Before the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the blue part of the Louisiana Purchase had to be free. After the Kansas-Nebraska Act, they can vote using the concept of popular sovereignty if they are going to be free or a slave state. Now, what happens because of the Kansas-Nebraska Act is Kansas can vote whether they are going to be a slave state or a free state or free soil, using the concept of popular sovereignty. Now, what happens is popular sovereignty is supposed to be those who exist in the territory will vote. However, what happens is people start to move there temporarily. And what you had is you had those who were pro-slavery move into the Kansas territory, and those who were anti-slavery move into the Kansas territory. And they move there deliberately to vote and try to swing the vote to a slave state or a free state. Well, and as expected, and you can see the increased tensions between the anti-slavery North and the pro-slavery South, they didn't get along too well. And eventually, all of this tension would erupt in violence. And I will make a fictional scenario here where this violence erupts. We can pretty much imagine that someone drew first through the first offense. So let's make our farmer throw our pitchfork. Well, every reaction requires another reaction. So, because Uncle Tom's Cabin had been influencing the Northern thought, we're going to pretend that our Northern abolitionist woman throws her copy of Uncle Tom's Cabin over and hits the farmer. Now, when you're injured, you bleed. So, when the Northern abolitionist man was hit, he bled. This guy bleeds in his hand. Eventually, fighting erupts, and it becomes quite violent. So, because of the bloodshed, Kansas gets the nickname Bleeding Kansas. And I'm making light the violence that was there. But what we see is this was the first time that pro-slavery and anti-slavery people are fighting. And it is more of like a forecast of things to come, that this fight has gotten violent, and that's where it's going. So, now there were some, you may have heard of John Brown, which we're going to learn a little bit about later. He was fighting in Bleeding Kansas. Well, the situation went like this. Kansas can vote by popular sovereignty to be slave-free. So to influence the vote, Southern pro-slavery and Northern abolitionists move there temporarily. And fight. Well, this gives Kansas the nickname Bleeding Kansas. Let's take a look at some of the PowerPoint slides. Here's a book on Bleeding Kansas. You can see some of them were well armed. They had cannons. Here's a picture of John Brown. Now, it looks like John Brown is standing between the two forces, but John Brown would have been on this side here, fighting for the abolitionists. And Bleeding Kansas becomes a statewide civil war. Here's another picture. I made light with my drawings, but I'm sure it was awful, with much death and destruction. So, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which replaced the Missouri Compromise, lets people choose by popular sovereignty if their territory is going to be slave or free. This causes Northern abolitionists to move into the Kansas territory. Southern slave owners also move into the Kansas territory. Soon, their fighting led people to call the area Bleeding Kansas. Now, the result of Bleeding Kansas would be the formation of a new political party. This new political party would be the Anti-Slavery Party, the Republicans. Some Northern Whigs, if you remember, the Whigs were previously the Federalists, and even Northern Democrats were appalled at the violence and joined with the Free Soil Party, which was those who wanted slavery to stop expanding, and the Liberty Party, which were abolitionists, to form a new political party, the Republicans, the Anti-Slavery Party. In the next lesson, we are going to learn more about the Republican Party and about the event that pushes South Carolina to secede, which you already know, is the election of the Republican anti-slavery president, Abraham Lincoln. Until then, thank you for listening. I hope you did well.